Max, a bright young boy with an infectious smile, loved spending his afternoons in the front yard, soaking in the sun, and enjoying the simple pleasures of his life. His wheelchair was an extension of him, something that helped him navigate the world, but never stopped him from enjoying the things he loved. He was just like any other child, except for one small thing. He couldn't walk. His father, Detective Daniel, had always made sure to provide Max with everything he needed, not just physically but emotionally. They had a bond stronger than anything else, built on love and mutual respect. Max was his world, and there was nothing Daniel wouldn't do to protect him. On one particularly warm afternoon, Max rolled his wheelchair up to the sidewalk at the end of their driveway, enjoying the view of the peaceful neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a soft, golden glow over the street, and for a moment everything seemed right. Max's laughter echoed down the block as he recounted a funny story from school to his father, who was inside a house, watching him through the window. The sound of birds chirping filled the air, and the breeze carried the scent of freshly mowed lawns. But peace is a fragile thing, and in the blink of an eye, it can shatter. From the corner of the street, Detective Daniel saw her, the HOA Karen. Linda. She was a woman whose presence had long been a source of tension in the neighborhood. Linda, the president of the Homeowners Association, had made it her life's mission to enforce every rule, no matter how small or petty. Her sharp tongue and self-righteousness made her the subject of gossip among the neighbors, but no one dared to speak up. She had the power, and she wasn't afraid to use it. For some, she was a nuisance. For others, she was an outright bully. And for Max, today, she was about to become something much worse. Linda's eyes narrowed as she spotted Max in his wheelchair. She marched across the street, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement, her eyes fixed on the boy. Max didn't see her coming, too absorbed in his own world. He was completely unaware of the looming danger. Linda's voice was sharp when she spoke. "You can't park your wheelchair on the sidewalk like that," she barked, her tone condescending. "You're blocking the way. This is a violation of HOA rules." Max blinked in confusion, trying to process what she was saying. He had been in that spot countless times before, without a single complaint. "I'm not blocking anyone," he said, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "I'm just sitting here." Linda's expression twisted with annoyance. "You're blocking the sidewalk," she snapped again, stepping closer to him. "You don't get to just do whatever you want. You have to follow the rules." Max, confused and frightened by the intensity of her words, started to back away, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair as he tried to move. "I didn't mean to block anyone," he stammered, his voice trembling now. He didn't know why she was so angry, why she was acting like this. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. All he wanted was to sit and enjoy his afternoon, but Linda's relentless pursuit of him was suffocating. "You don't get it, do you?" Linda said, her voice rising in anger. "People like you think you can just take over spaces and do whatever you want, and it's not going to fly anymore." She stepped closer to Max, and her eyes flashed with something far more sinister than simple frustration. "You don't belong here." Max froze, the color draining from his face. He had never been treated like this before, not by anyone. His mind raced, and he felt the weight of her words settle in, pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath caught in his throat. His legs, which had always been his source of frustration and pain, felt useless now. The person in front of him, someone who had authority over the neighborhood, had made him feel small, insignificant, and helpless. As the tension in the air grew, Daniel watched from the window, his pulse quickening. His protective instincts kicked in, and he could feel the anger bubbling up inside him. His son was vulnerable, helpless, and here was Linda, taking advantage of that, bullying Max in the most brutal way possible. He had been watching from the moment she had approached, his detective instincts telling him that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just a simple complaint. Linda wasn't just enforcing rules, she was targeting his son, and that Daniel couldn't stand. He stood frozen for a moment, watching the scene unfold, his thoughts a whirlwind. But then, without hesitation, he moved. His detective training kicked in. Every step he took was calculated, deliberate. He knew he needed to act quickly, but he couldn't risk alerting Linda to his presence. He had to remain calm, composed. He was a detective, but right now he was also a father, and fathers protect their children. As Linda continued to berate Max, the situation took a darker turn. The sound of a gun clicking echoed in the air, sharp and final. Daniel's heart stopped. In that split second, he realized what was happening. Linda wasn't just upset. She wasn't just harassing Max. She had taken things too far. She had pulled a gun. The HOA Karen, who had been a petty nuisance for so long, was now a dangerous threat. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, but his body moved before his mind could process it fully. He was just steps away from making his presence known. Max was still unaware of the danger, but Daniel could see it clearly now. Linda was losing control, her rage overtaking her. The weapon in her hand wasn't just a tool for intimidation, it was a symbol of her power, her authority, and her willingness to go to any lengths to enforce her version of the law. With every passing second, Daniel's mind raced. He had to get to Max, but he also had to stay calm. He had to think like a detective, not a father, at least for a moment longer. He knew Linda wouldn't hesitate to pull that trigger if she felt threatened. The moment was fragile, delicate, and everything depended on how Daniel approached it. Max was shaking now, his eyes wide with fear, unaware of the imminent danger. Daniel's heart broke at the sight of his son in such a vulnerable position. It wasn't just about the threat Linda posed, it was the fact that she had reduced his son to this state made him fear for his life when he hadn't done anything wrong. As Daniel stepped closer, he knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let Linda harm Max, not even for a second. The protective instinct in him surged again, fiercer than ever. His son was in danger, and he wasn't going to let anyone, especially not someone like Linda, take that from him. The stakes were higher than ever, and this time there would be no more running. The neighborhood of Ridgewood Estates was a quiet, suburban haven where the pace of life moved at the rhythm of the seasons. Large oak trees lined the streets, their branches stretching wide, providing shade to the houses that stood nestled along the cul-de-sac. The lawns were neat and manicured, every house resembling the next in its perfect symmetry. It was a community where everything appeared in its proper place, but underneath the surface, a quiet undercurrent of discontent had begun to fester. At the heart of this neighborhood, where peace seemed to reign, lived Detective Daniel Carter and his son Max. Their house, modest but comfortable, was located at the end of the block, surrounded by a small, lush garden that Max had helped design himself. Max, though physically disabled and bound to a wheelchair, was an incredibly bright and curious young boy. His world was not defined by his disability. Rather, it was shaped by his vast imagination, his love for adventure, and the boundless love he received from his father. Max's disability was something that had shaped their lives in ways that were often difficult to navigate, but Daniel had always been determined to provide Max with a life as full and rich as any other child. Daniel, a seasoned detective with the local police department, had a reputation for his meticulous attention to detail and his unwavering determination to seek justice. His career had always been driven by his desire to protect the vulnerable, and no one was more important to him than Max. In the world of investigations, Daniel had seen the darkest corners of humanity, but at home, with Max, he was reminded of what truly mattered: love, care, and the promise to protect. Daniel's days were often spent working long hours investigating crimes and solving cases, but he always made sure to come home in time for dinner to help Max with his homework or to spend time in the garden. The bond between them was deep and unbreakable. Daniel was more than just Max's father. He was his protector, his confidant, and his greatest supporter. He often reminded Max that his disability didn't define him, that his worth was in his intelligence, his kindness, and his ability to make the world a better place. Max believed him, and together, they created a world where Max's limitations were mere challenges to be overcome, not roadblocks to his happiness. The quiet charm of Ridgewood Estates, however, was starting to wear thin. The very thing that had once made it an idyllic place to live, the community rules and regulations, had become a source of tension and resentment. And the one person who embodied this growing dissatisfaction was none other than Linda Matthews, the HOA president. Linda, who had been elected to the position some years ago, had quickly cemented her role as the community's self appointed enforcer. Where there had once been casual suggestions for lawn maintenance and minor neighborhood guidelines, Linda had transformed the HOA into a ruthless authority that left little room for personal freedom. The once lighthearted community meetings were now filled with strict rules, fines, and an overwhelming focus on conformity. Residents who had lived peacefully for years now found themselves constantly scrutinized by Linda's hawk-like gaze. The smallest infraction, an untrimmed hedge, a misplaced garbage can could result in a fine or an angry letter. Over time, her heavy-handed approach had earned her a reputation as the HOA Karen, a term that, while mocking, was undeniably accurate. Max and Daniel had felt the tension growing, but they had always tried to ignore it. They had enough on their plates. Max, with his physical challenges, had a world of his own to navigate, and Daniel, as a detective, was used to dealing with far more dangerous situations than the trivial issues that came from a neighborhood association. But as time went on, Daniel began to notice how many of his neighbors were becoming increasingly fed up with Linda's actions. The quiet whispers at the grocery store, the hushed conversations at the mailbox, and the sighs of frustration from those who had been ticketed for the slightest infraction all pointed to one thing. Linda was out of control. She had found power in her position and was wielding it in ways that no one had expected. As the weeks went by, the once gentle hum of neighborhood life had turned into a low, persistent murmur of dissatisfaction. There were grumblings about Linda's constant surveillance, her penchant for nitpicking the smallest details of people's properties, and her growing obsession with maintaining order at any cost. People had started avoiding her, taking alternate routes to avoid running into her during her patrols. There was a collective sense of unease hanging over Ridgewood Estates, a sense that no one was truly safe from Linda's prying eyes. Even the usually friendly waves exchanged between neighbors had become stiff and strained, as if everyone was walking on eggshells, afraid of the next call they'd receive from Linda. For Daniel, this had always been something of a background noise, something he could distance himself from as long as Max was safe and happy. But one afternoon, when he had returned home from work, he saw his son in his wheelchair, sitting by the sidewalk in front of their house, enjoying the sunshine. Daniel noticed the familiar sight of Linda marching toward him, clipboard in hand. At first, he didn't think much of it. It was just another one of her routine checkups. But then, as he stood in the doorway, watching, something shifted in the air. Linda was speaking to Max, her tone sharp and disapproving. Daniel couldn't hear the exact words, but the body language was unmistakable. Max's shoulders were slumped, and he was trying to explain something, his voice meek and unsure. Linda, on the other hand, seemed to be getting increasingly agitated. She pointed at Max's wheelchair, then at the sidewalk, and Daniel's gut clenched. He stepped forward, his detective instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. He could feel the tension building between them, an undercurrent of anger that didn't belong in a simple conversation. Max didn't deserve this. No one did. Linda's behavior, her fixation on rules, was no longer just a matter of maintaining order. It had become an obsession, a tool for asserting control over people who were just trying to live their lives. She wasn't just enforcing regulations anymore. She was making people feel small, powerless. And in that moment, as Daniel watched his son's discomfort, he realized that this was no longer just about rules. It was personal. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. Ridgewood Estates had already been split by Linda's overzealous enforcement of HOA rules, but it wasn't until Max found himself in the crosshairs of her obsessive authority that Daniel realized just how far things had gone. The quiet neighborhood, the one they had come to love, was now a battleground, a place where fear, control, and power were silently tearing it apart. And it was all about to come to a head. As the breeze picked up and rustled through the trees, Daniel's mind began to race. The bond between him and Max was more than just father and son, it was a promise, a vow to protect. And now, as the HOA Karen continued her relentless pursuit of perfection, Daniel knew that it was time for him to step in. This battle wasn't just about a sidewalk. It was about everything that had been taken from his family. And he wasn't going to let anyone, especially Linda, take one more thing away from them. Max sat in his wheelchair at the edge of the sidewalk, staring up at the sky as the soft warmth of the afternoon sun bathed the street in golden hues. His father, Detective Daniel Carter, had just finished a long shift, but now he was at home, resting inside, leaving Max to enjoy the quiet of the neighborhood. Max loved these moments of solitude, where everything felt calm and peaceful. His wheelchair, while sometimes a reminder of his disability, had never stopped him from experiencing the world in his own way. But today, that peace would be shattered. Linda Matthews, the HOA president, was already walking briskly down the street when Max first noticed her. He had learned to recognize her by her stiff posture and the determined look in her eyes, as though she were always on a mission, one that often involved enforcing rules no one else seemed to care about. Max sighed and looked away, hoping she would keep walking, as she often did when she saw him outside. But today, she was heading straight for him. Max didn't fully understand why Linda had always treated him with such hostility. She had been condescending when they first met, offering him help with things he never needed help with. But over time, it had grown worse. Max felt a deep sense of discomfort whenever she was near. Today, as she approached, he felt that same unease, his stomach tightening as he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Max, Linda's voice cut through the quiet, sharp, and demanding, "You can't park your wheelchair here. You're blocking the sidewalk." Max blinked, his brows furrowing in confusion. The sidewalk was wide enough, and there was plenty of room for anyone to pass. He had sat in that exact spot many times before, never once being told it was a problem. "I'm not blocking anyone," Max said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I'm just sitting here." Linda stood in front of him, hands planted on her hips, her eyes narrowing. "That's exactly what I'm saying. You're blocking the sidewalk. I've had complaints about this before. People need to be able to walk freely. You can't just take up the whole space." Max shifted in his wheelchair, trying to gather his thoughts. "But I'm not in the way," he insisted. "No one's coming through right now, and I'm not hurting anyone." Linda didn't seem to care. Her gaze hardened and her voice grew colder. "It doesn't matter if anyone's coming through or not. The rules are the rules, Max, and you're breaking them. You don't get special treatment just because you're in a wheelchair." Max's face flushed with embarrassment. He hadn't meant to upset anyone, and he wasn't used to being told off like this. It was clear Linda wasn't going to listen to reason. He opened his mouth to explain again, but she cut him off, her words sharp and forceful. "I'm reporting this to the HOA," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "You'll get a fine, just like everyone else. This isn't your personal space to take over. You should have known better." Max's stomach turned. He had heard stories about Linda's obsession with rules, but he had never imagined she would turn on him like this. His heart raced as he looked down, unable to meet her gaze. The last thing he wanted was to be punished for something that felt so trivial. It wasn't as though he was breaking any real law. He was just sitting outside in the quiet, enjoying the sunshine. But Linda wasn't finished. Her voice was growing louder, more furious, as if she were getting pleasure from reprimanding him. "You think you can just ignore the rules, don't you? Well, I'm done being lenient. You're causing a disturbance, and I won't let it slide anymore." Max tried to explain once more, his voice wavering, but Linda wasn't listening. The tension in the air grew thick, and for a moment it felt as though time had slowed. Max's hands gripped the wheels of his chair, trying to steady himself, his body betraying him as he felt a wave of panic rise within him. It was clear Linda wasn't interested in talking anymore. She was angry, no, enraged, and that scared him. He could feel the weight of her judgment pressing down on him. Then, without warning, Linda's demeanor shifted. Her eyes flashed with something dangerous, something that Max had never seen before. A twisted sense of power seemed to take over her, and she moved in closer. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job, Max," she sneered. "You think you're exempt from the rules? You're nothing but a problem in this neighborhood." Max's hands were shaking now, his heart pounding. The street that had always felt so safe now felt suffocating. The sun seemed too bright, and the sky, once peaceful, felt too large. He wanted to retreat into his house, but his body didn't move fast enough. He was trapped in the chair, his legs useless, unable to escape. And then, before he could comprehend what was happening, Linda pulled out a gun. The shock hit him like a jolt of electricity, his body frozen as he stared at the weapon now aimed at him. He could hardly breathe, his chest tightening as panic surged through him. What was happening? Why was she doing this? He had never seen anyone, especially someone in a position of authority, act like this before. The gun, cold and metallic in her hands, pointed directly at him. "You think I'm bluffing?" Linda sneered, her voice lower, colder than before. "You think you can just sit there and break the rules with no consequences? I don't care what you think, Max. You're going to learn that there are consequences for everything." Max's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. He couldn't comprehend the danger he was in. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was threatening him. Tears welled up in his eyes as he instinctively tried to retreat, but his chair wouldn't budge. He was completely exposed, completely powerless. But then, just as Max's fear reached its peak, a voice rang out from behind him. "Put the gun down, Linda." It was the last voice Max expected to hear, but it was the one he needed. He turned, his body shaking with relief as he saw his father, Daniel, step into view. Daniel had been nearby, watching the situation unfold from the window of their house. His detective training had kicked in immediately, and he had assessed the situation from a distance, knowing something was wrong. Daniel's voice was calm but firm, every word cutting through the air with authority. He was in control now, the protector Max needed. Linda's grip on the gun faltered as she registered his presence, her eyes widening with shock. "Put the gun down," Daniel repeated, his voice unwavering. "You don't want to do this. This isn't you." Max felt a surge of relief wash over him, though the fear still lingered in his chest. His father was here, and for the first time he felt a sense of safety. Daniel was the one person who could stop this madness, and Max trusted him completely. But Linda wasn't done yet. Her eyes flickered from Daniel to the gun in her hand, her anger still boiling beneath the surface. She was losing control, and in her desperation, she seemed to forget the consequences of her actions. Max held his breath, his eyes fixed on his father, praying he would be able to stop Linda before things went too far. The tension between them was unbearable, the air thick with the potential for violence. Everything depended on how this moment unfolded. Could Daniel de-escalate the situation before Linda pulled the trigger? Time slowed as Daniel slowly approached, his gaze fixed on Linda, never leaving her for a second. He wasn't just a detective now. He was a father, and he was about to do whatever it took to protect his son. The moments after the confrontation were a blur of raw emotion, confusion, and disbelief. The world around Max seemed to slow, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in only when the immediate danger was over. The gun that had been pointed at him only seconds ago was no longer in Linda's hand. She had been escorted away by Daniel, her face twisted with anger and fear as she was subdued. But even as the immediate threat evaporated, the lingering shock remained, settling deep within Max's chest, making it hard to breathe, to think, to understand. Max couldn't comprehend the magnitude of the situation. Why had Linda, someone who lived on their street, someone who was supposed to be a part of their community, threatened him? He had done nothing wrong. His mind scrambled to make sense of it all. What had made Linda snap like that? Was it because of his wheelchair? Was it his disability? Was he so different that she felt the need to punish him? Max had never been a child to think of himself as different. Sure, his wheelchair set him apart in some ways, but he had always taken pride in what he could do, in the person he was, not the limitations his body had imposed upon him. He didn't understand how that could have made him the target of such rage. His hands were still trembling, and as his father, Daniel, gently guided him back into the house, Max struggled to keep his emotions in check. It was hard to ignore the tightness in his chest, the knot that had formed deep within him as he thought about the terrifying moments when he had stared down the barrel of a gun. Max had heard of things like this on the news, seen it in movies, but never in a million years had he imagined it could happen to him. His breath hitched as he tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His mind replayed Linda's furious words, the fear that gripped him when he realized what was happening, and the sheer terror of having his life threatened for something so insignificant. Once inside the house, Daniel guided Max to the couch, his voice calm but firm as he spoke. "You're okay, Max," he said, checking him over, making sure he wasn't hurt physically. "I'm right here. You're safe now." Max couldn't look his father in the eye. Instead, he stared down at his lap, his hands still shaking. His mind wasn't on his father's reassurances, it was on Linda, on the gun, on the terrifying reality that someone had wanted to hurt him, to end his life, for simply existing in the world the way he did. "I don't understand, Dad," Max whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why did she do that?" "I didn't do anything wrong." Daniel took a deep breath, kneeling down in front of Max and taking his hands in his own. The detective in him wanted to jump into action, to get the authorities involved, to make sure that Linda faced the consequences of her actions. But the father in him, the man who had watched his son grow, had watched him overcome so many obstacles in his life, felt a deep, painful need to protect him, to shield him from the emotional fallout of this ordeal. "I know you didn't, son," Daniel said, his voice low and soothing, though his heart was raging inside. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people snap. They let their anger and frustration control them. But it's not your fault, Max. You didn't deserve this. No one does." Max looked at his father, his face full of confusion and pain. "But I'm not like everyone else, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm in a wheelchair. I'm different. Maybe that's why she hated me." Daniel's heart shattered as he heard the words leave his son's lips. He had worked so hard to teach Max that his disability didn't define him. Max had always been a bright, imaginative, and capable child. None of that was dependent on his ability to walk. But in that moment, Daniel saw the vulnerability in his son's eyes. Max had been made to feel different, inferior, even though he had never let that define him before. Daniel pulled Max into a tight hug, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You are not different, Max. You are special. You are perfect just the way you are. And anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. You hear me? You're perfect. Never forget that." Max clung to his father, his sobs muffled against Daniel's shoulder. He had always felt like an outsider in some ways, because of his wheelchair, because of the way he moved through the world. But it wasn't until today that he felt that difference in a way that was visceral, threatening, terrifying. He had seen the world as his playground before, but now the world felt dangerous, hostile, unwelcoming. Daniel held him tighter, trying to push down his own anger. As a detective, he had seen the worst of humanity. He had dealt with criminals, liars, and thieves. But never had he encountered someone like Linda. Never had he felt so deeply the weight of what it meant to be a parent, to want to protect your child from the cruelty of the world. His mind raced, thinking about what needed to happen next, how he would bring Linda to justice, how he would ensure this never happened again. But all of that had to wait. For now, his priority was his son. Max's emotional well-being had to come first. The detective inside Daniel fought to remain calm, to suppress the fury that burned inside him. Linda had pulled a gun on his son. Max had been threatened with death, and Daniel couldn't let that go unanswered. But as a father, his protective instincts wanted to shield Max from the horrors of the world. He didn't want his son to be scarred by this experience, to see the ugliness of what people were capable of. "I'm going to make sure she doesn't hurt anyone else," Daniel said softly, his voice steady now. "I promise you that. But right now, I just need you to know that I'm here. I'm always here, Max. I'm not going anywhere." Max wiped his eyes, nodding, but his mind was still racing. How could he ever feel safe again? How could he trust the world after what had happened? He wanted to believe his father's words, to believe that everything would be okay, but the fear that had settled in his chest was hard to shake. The world had just become a much scarier place, and no matter how hard he tried to push it away, that fear lingered in the back of his mind, gnawing at him. Daniel watched his son carefully, his own heart breaking as he saw the depth of the trauma Max had endured. Max might heal physically, but emotionally, this would take time. Daniel knew that. It wasn't just about getting justice for what had happened. It was about helping Max heal from the inside, from the wound Linda had created with her hate and cruelty. As the hours passed and Max had finally fallen asleep, Daniel sat alone in the living room, staring out the window. His mind was still reeling from the events of the day. As a detective, he had dealt with cases that shook him, cases that kept him up at night, wondering about the nature of evil and how far people would go to satisfy their egos. But this was different. This wasn't just about a crime, it was about his son, his flesh and blood, being threatened in the most violent way imaginable. Daniel's mind wandered back to the moment when Linda had raised the gun. The image of that gun aimed at Max would stay with him forever. It was hard to reconcile the man he had become, the detective with a strong sense of justice, with the father he had always been, someone who wanted nothing more than to protect his son from harm. The two identities were at odds with each other, fighting for his attention, his focus. But one thing was clear. This was no longer just about a simple confrontation with an HOA president. It was personal, and he would not rest until Max was safe, until Linda had been held accountable for what she had done. For now, all Daniel could do was be the father Max needed him to be. But tomorrow, he would be the detective again, and Linda would pay. Daniel sat alone in the quiet of his living room, his mind racing. Max had been asleep for hours, but the worry lines on Daniel's face remained, etched deeper than ever before. Linda's actions had shaken him to his core, but it wasn't just about her threatening his son. It was the realization that she wasn't just a random, isolated incident. The more Daniel thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. This wasn't an isolated act of violence. Linda was a habitual offender, and that made her all the more dangerous. Max had gone through hell today, and Daniel had failed him in the worst way. He had promised to protect Max, to keep him safe, and yet here they were. Max had been nearly killed on their own front yard by someone who, on the surface, appeared to be just a neighborhood enforcer. But this wasn't just some frustrated neighbor. Linda wasn't merely an HOA president enforcing petty rules. She was someone who had used her power for far more insidious purposes. And Daniel couldn't let that slide. He had already made up his mind. This wasn't going to be solved by mere complaints to the HOA board or filing a simple report. No, Daniel had been a detective long enough to know that sometimes justice required more than what the law could offer at first glance. It required a plan, and right now that plan had to be meticulous, strategic, and above all thorough. The first step in his plan was to gather information. Daniel had an arsenal of tools at his disposal, from his knowledge of criminal behavior to the resources his position afforded him. He wasn't just any ordinary civilian, he was a trained investigator, and he knew how to get results. But as he prepared to take action, he understood the gravity of what he was about to do. He wasn't just uncovering a case of harassment. He was peeling back layers of darkness in a woman who had a history of manipulation, intimidation, and outright violence. The next morning, Daniel wasted no time. He began his investigation by revisiting the scene of the confrontation, his eyes scanning the street with a sense of purpose. He walked over to the spot where Max had been sitting, now seemingly peaceful, but the memories of the encounter were still fresh in Daniel's mind. He could still hear Linda's voice, her threats, her cruelty. The image of her pointing the gun at Max was seared into his brain, but that wasn't enough. He needed hard evidence, and he had to move quickly. Linda would already be covering her tracks. He walked over to his neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, an elderly man who lived 2 doors down. Mr. Reynolds had been in the neighborhood for decades and had witnessed more than his fair share of HOA-related incidents. Daniel had spoken to him before about general neighborhood matters, but this was different. This time, Daniel had to dig deeper. "Morning, Mr. Reynolds." Daniel greeted him, keeping his tone casual but purposeful. "I was hoping you could help me with something." Mr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses and looked at Daniel, sensing the weight of his words. "What's on your mind, detective?" "I need to ask you about Linda Matthews," Daniel said, his voice low, but not overly suspicious. He had to play it cool. "You've lived here a long time, seen the way things go around here. Have you ever had any issues with her, or heard anything unusual about how she handles the HOA? Mr. Reynolds looked around before leaning in, lowering his voice. "You don't know the half of it, son," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "That woman, she's been bullying folks for years. You wouldn't believe the things she's done. It's always little things, fines for people with an overgrown lawn, complaints about paint colors, but it adds up. And anyone who doesn't comply, well, let's just say she doesn't stop at a letter in the mail. I've seen her harass people, threaten them. I've seen her use the power of the HOA to make people's lives miserable." Daniel's blood ran cold. He had suspected it, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it made it all the more real. "What kind of harassment are we talking about, Mr. Reynolds? You want to hear the worst of it? I've heard stories about her threatening people with eviction notices, using their HOA dues as leverage. And if someone dares to fight back, she makes their lives hell. Fines for the smallest things, inspections at odd hours, you name it. She doesn't stop until she breaks them. It's her way, or the highway, detective." The more Daniel listened, the clearer it became that Linda had been using her position to terrorize the neighborhood, and what had happened with Max was just another instance of her overstepping her bounds. But what worried him most was the unspoken truth that Linda had crossed the line into something much darker than just petty rule enforcement. She wasn't just a neighborhood tyrant, she was capable of violence. And if he didn't act quickly, she would do it again. "Have you ever seen her go this far before?" Daniel asked, pressing for more. Mr. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded gravely. "I've seen her threaten people before, but never like that. A gun? That's something else. You need to be careful, son. She's dangerous, and if she thinks you're after her, she won't hesitate to go even further." Daniel's mind was working at full speed now. He needed more than just stories. He needed proof, something that would tie Linda to this escalation. But finding that proof wouldn't be easy. Daniel had worked enough cases to know that people like Linda didn't leave fingerprints. They covered their tracks meticulously. He turned and walked back to his house, his thoughts racing. The next step was clear. He had to speak to more neighbors, collect as many testimonies as he could. It was important to build a case, piece by piece, not only to hold Linda accountable for what she had done to Max, but to expose her for what she really was, a woman who had used her position to bully and intimidate for far too long. But Daniel's investigation didn't stop there. He was a detective, and he had access to resources that most people didn't. He spent the next few hours reviewing old HOA records, emails, complaints, warnings, and quickly realized something even more disturbing. There were multiple instances where Linda had used her authority to make life difficult for others. There were fines that had been levied without cause, complaints filed that had been ignored, and an overwhelming pattern of intimidation. And that's when Daniel stumbled upon the unthinkable: documents showing that Linda had been manipulating the HOA's budget, diverting funds for her personal use. The more he dug, the more troubling it became. Linda hadn't just been abusing her power with the HOA members. She had been exploiting her position for her own gain, using the HOA as a front to line her pockets. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a full-blown case of corruption. Now, Daniel had everything he needed. He had gathered evidence of Linda's abuse of power, intimidation tactics, and financial misconduct. But even as the pieces fell into place, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this would be far from simple. Linda wasn't going to go down quietly, and she was dangerous. He had to be careful, but he also had to move quickly. The clock was ticking, and every second Linda was allowed to roam free was another second she had to cover her tracks to continue her reign of terror. Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind heavy with the weight of what was to come. He had all the pieces. Now it was time to put them together and bring Linda Matthews down. No more lies, no more intimidation. This time it was justice. And Daniel wasn't going to stop until it was served. Daniel could feel the weight of everything he had uncovered pressing down on him as he stood in front of Linda Matthews' house. The quiet, suburban street had never felt so tense, every step he took toward her front door feeling like the beginning of a storm. It had been days since the confrontation with Max, but every detail was still vivid in his mind. The moment the gun had been pulled, the terror in his son's eyes, the realization that Linda wasn't just a nuisance. She was a dangerous, manipulative woman who had crossed a line that could not be undone. In the days that followed, Daniel had gathered every piece of evidence he could find. He had spoken to neighbors, reviewed HOA records, and uncovered a disturbing pattern of Linda's abuse of power, her intimidation tactics, and to his horror, her financial misconduct. It was worse than he had imagined. She hadn't just been harassing residents, she had been using her position to line her pockets, manipulating funds, and diverting resources for her own gain. The more Daniel uncovered, the more disgusted he became by what Linda had been able to get away with. It was time for it to end. His plan had been simple: confront Linda with everything he had uncovered, make her face the consequences of her actions. He had already contacted the authorities, and they were on standby, ready to move the moment Linda was confronted. But Daniel knew this wasn't just about bringing Linda to justice. It was about making sure she couldn't hurt anyone else, especially not Max, ever again. As he reached the front door of Linda's house, Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Linda wasn't someone who would back down quietly. She was used to controlling the narrative, to being the one with the power. But that power was about to shift. He knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet morning. The door swung open a moment later, and there she stood, Linda Matthews, her expression cold and unfazed, as if she were expecting him. She didn't even flinch when she saw him standing there, a man she had once ruled over without question, now ready to challenge her every move. Daniel, Linda said, her tone polite but laced with thinly veiled contempt. What brings you here? I need to talk to you, Daniel said, his voice steady but laced with the resolve he had been holding in for days. He stepped forward, not waiting for an invitation. We need to have a conversation about what happened with my son, Max. Linda raised an eyebrow, her face contorting into a semblance of concern. What are you talking about? Max is fine, isn't he? I haven't done anything wrong. Daniel's gaze narrowed, the anger simmering beneath the surface, threatening to break free. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Linda, he said, his voice sharp. The way you threatened Max, pointed a gun at him for no reason. The way you've used your position to bully and intimidate people in this neighborhood. It ends today. Linda's expression didn't falter. If anything, she seemed almost amused by the accusation. You've been exaggerating, Daniel, she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. I was just enforcing the rules. Max was breaking the law by blocking the sidewalk, and I had every right to address it. If you're trying to make something out of nothing, then I don't know what to say. Daniel's pulse quickened. She was playing the victim. It was a tactic he had seen before, a way to shift the blame onto others, to twist the narrative and turn it into something it wasn't. But this time, it wasn't going to work. He wasn't backing down. No, Linda, Daniel said, his voice low but unwavering. You're not getting away with this. I've been gathering evidence, talking to the neighbors, reviewing HOA records. I know about the fines you've levied without cause, the complaints you've ignored, the intimidation you've used to control people. And I know about the money you've stolen from the HOA fund. You've been using your position to bully and manipulate everyone around you, and I'm done letting you get away with it. Linda's face went pale, and for the first time, Daniel saw a crack in her facade. She shifted her weight, nervously, glancing around as if searching for an escape. But there was no escape this time. She had been exposed. I don't know what you think you found, Linda said, her voice now trembling, but I've done nothing illegal. I've helped this neighborhood, kept things in order. People should be grateful for the rules I've set. They need someone like me. Daniel's expression hardened. You've terrorized this neighborhood, Linda. People are scared of you. They've been too afraid to speak out, but I've spoken to them. They're all willing to stand behind me and tell the truth. You're a bully using the power you've stolen to hurt people. And now it's time for you to face the consequences. Linda's eyes widened, and for a moment, Daniel thought he saw genuine fear flicker in them. She had spent so long in control, so long believing that no one could touch her, that the idea of losing her power seemed unfathomable. She quickly regained her composure, however, her arrogance returning as she straightened her posture. You're making a mistake, Daniel. You've got it all wrong. If you think you can just ruin my life with your lies, you've got another thing coming. Daniel didn't back down. You're wrong, Linda, he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. I have the law on my side and I have the truth. And that's what's going to bring you down. Linda's confidence wavered for just a second, but then she snapped. I'm not going to let you ruin me, she spat. You think you're some hero? You think you've got the moral high ground? You're just as bad as the people you accuse. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Daniel stepped forward, narrowing the space between them. You have no idea what I'm willing to do to protect my family, he said, his tone low and dangerous. You're about to lose everything, Linda. Your position, your power, everything you've used to control this neighborhood. And I'm going to make sure you're held accountable for every single thing you've done. Linda's eyes darted to the door behind her, as if she were considering a way to escape, but she knew it was too late. The confrontation had escalated beyond anything she could have imagined. The power had shifted. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She was the one being hunted. The emotional wall she had carefully constructed for so long began to crack. The confident, domineering woman who had once held the entire neighborhood in her grip was now a frightened, desperate figure, scrambling for an escape. Her mask of superiority slipped entirely, revealing a woman who had long relied on manipulation, fear, and power to get her way. Don't do this, she pleaded, her voice shaking. You don't know what you're getting into. You'll regret this. I'll make sure you regret it. But Daniel wasn't swayed. He had heard enough, seen enough. This wasn't just about the gun she had pulled on Max. It was about every person she had crushed under the weight of her authority, every neighbor who had suffered in silence, too afraid to stand up to her. He had a duty to protect his son, to protect this community, and he wasn't going to let Linda get away with it anymore. Don't worry, Linda, Daniel said, his voice steady. You're about to face the consequences for your actions. The law is on my side. Your time as the HOA president is over. At that moment, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, getting closer. Daniel had already made the call, and the police were on their way to arrest Linda. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Linda's face turned pale as she heard the sirens, and she took a step back, her face contorted in a mixture of fear and disbelief. No, this isn't happening, but it was happening. The power had shifted, and there was no turning back. Linda's reign of terror was over. She would face the consequences for her actions, and Daniel was going to make sure she never hurt anyone again. As Linda was escorted out of her home in handcuffs, Daniel stood firm, his hand resting gently on Max's shoulder. The weight of everything that had happened was finally beginning to settle, but Daniel knew this wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had been too afraid to stand up to Linda. It was a victory for justice, and it was a victory for Max, who had faced unimaginable fear but had come through it stronger than ever. Max looked up at his father, his eyes wide with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Dad, did we really do it? Daniel nodded, his voice soft but resolute. Yeah, Max, we did, and I'll always be here to make sure you're safe. Always. The weight of the past few days seemed to lift as Max smiled, finally feeling a sense of peace settle in. He was safe, and for the first time in a long time, so was their neighborhood. The days following Linda's arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and most importantly, recovery. The neighborhood once gripped in a quiet, constant tension, seemed to exhale all at once. It was as though a heavy cloud had lifted, the peace slowly returning to the homes where residents had been too afraid to speak up. But for Daniel and Max, the battle wasn't over yet. Though the immediate threat had been neutralized, the emotional fallout lingered like an uninvited guest that wouldn't leave. Max, despite the relief of knowing Linda's reign of terror was over, was still grappling with the trauma of what had happened. He hadn't been the same since that day. The shock of the gun aimed at him, the fear that had taken root deep inside his chest, was something he couldn't shake. But with his father's unwavering presence, Max began to slowly piece himself back together. Daniel had been his rock through everything. As a father, his instinct was to protect, but he was also a detective, a professional trained to remain calm, composed, and methodical in the face of danger. Max had always seen his father as someone who was in control, someone who could handle anything that came their way. But after what had happened with Linda, Daniel had been forced to confront his own vulnerabilities, too. Sitting together in the living room one evening, Daniel watched Max as he carefully sketched in his notebook. It had become a routine, a quiet time for the two of them, where they could just sit and exist without the pressure of the world outside weighing them down. Max's pencil moved swiftly across the paper, but there was an unmistakable sadness in his eyes. Daniel could see it, even though Max tried to hide it. He had learned early on that Max's silence often meant he was processing something, working through emotions too complicated to articulate. "Max," Daniel said softly, breaking the silence. Max looked up, meeting his father's gaze, and for a moment, Daniel could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The weight of what he had been through was still there, still lingering. "How are you feeling?" Max hesitated, his fingers gripping the pencil a little too tightly. "I don't know," he said quietly, as if the words were foreign to him. "I'm okay, I guess. But, Dad, what if someone else does the same thing? What if there are more people like her?" Daniel's heart ached at the question. He wanted to tell Max that nothing like that would ever happen again, that he would always keep him safe. But the truth was, he couldn't make such a promise. The world wasn't that simple. People like Linda existed, and Max would always have to navigate the world with his disability, with the vulnerability that came with it. But Daniel also knew that he couldn't allow fear to define Max's world. He took a deep breath, sitting next to his son. "You know, Max," he began, choosing his words carefully, "the world is full of people who will try to bring you down to make you feel small. And sometimes it can feel like there's no way around them. But what I've learned, especially through everything we've been through, is that it's not the bad people who define us, it's how we respond to them. And you, Max, you've shown more strength and courage than I've ever seen in anyone. You've gone through something most people couldn't even imagine, and you're still here. You're still fighting. And that, my son, is what makes you stronger than anything or anyone." Max looked at him, his expression softening, but there was still a sadness in his eyes. "I don't know if I'm strong, Dad. I felt so scared. Like everything was out of control." "You were scared, Max. And that's okay," Daniel said gently. "Fear doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But what matters is that you didn't let that fear control you. You still stood up, even when things were at their worst. That takes more courage than you'll ever realize." Max sat quietly for a moment, processing his father's words. Then a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, just enough to show Daniel that, in time, the boy who had once faced down the barrel of a gun was beginning to find his strength again. But Daniel wasn't blind to the fact that healing, for both of them, was a journey. While Max was making progress, the emotional scars of the incident would take time to heal. And Daniel, too, was carrying his own weight. The image of Max sitting helpless in his wheelchair, terrified for his life, haunted him. No matter how much he told himself that he had done the right thing, saved his son, protected him, it didn't erase the fear that had gripped his heart during that moment. The detective in him could analyze every decision, every move, but the father in him could never let go of the feeling that he hadn't been there for Max when he needed him most. In the weeks that followed, The emotional toll on both of them began to manifest in different ways. Max, though slowly recovering, still found himself haunted by the memories of the confrontation. His wheelchair, once a symbol of his ability to move through the world, now felt like a target, something that made him stand out, something that others would use against him. But Daniel knew that this was just the start. He had to help Max see that he was not defined by the way others treated him, not by the violence Linda had inflicted on him. He was still the same boy who could light up a room with his smile, the same boy who had dreams and aspirations that reached far beyond the confines of his disability. Daniel, too, was slowly learning how to cope. His role as a father had always been clear-cut: protect, provide love, but this experience had forced him to question his identity. Being a detective had always been his calling, his sense of purpose. But now, as he watched Max slowly rebuild his confidence, Daniel realized that being a father was just as important, if not more so. He didn't need to have all the answers, didn't need to always be the one in control. What mattered was being there, truly present for Max in every way that counted. It wasn't long before the legal processes surrounding Linda's actions began to unfold. She was arrested, her crimes were made public, and the community finally saw her for what she was: someone who had abused her power, who had harassed and threatened countless people. The charges against her were serious, but the legal system would take time to run its course. Linda's position of authority was taken away, and while that gave the community a sense of justice, it didn't undo the damage she had caused. Max, however, began to see things differently. He slowly started returning to his normal routine, the one he had enjoyed before Linda's actions had turned their world upside down. He spent more time outside again, playing with his friends, drawing in his sketchbook, and laughing at the things that made him happy. His confidence began to grow, though it wasn't an overnight change. It was a process, a gradual rebuilding of trust in himself, in the world around him. And through it all, Daniel was there, supporting him every step of the way. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Daniel turned to Max, who was quietly gazing out at the neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the block, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Daniel felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. "You know, Max," Daniel said, his voice soft but full of emotion, "we've been through a lot, and I don't know if everything will ever go back to the way it was. But I do know one thing: we've come through this together, and that's what matters." Max looked up at his father, a small but genuine smile on his face. "Yeah, I think you're right, Dad. I don't think I'll ever forget what happened, but I'm not going to let it control me anymore. I've got you, and that's all I need." Daniel's heart swelled with pride. Max was stronger than he gave himself credit for, and together, they had overcome something none of them ever expected to face. The road to healing was still long, but they had taken the first steps, and that was enough. The neighborhood was quieter now. The shadow of Linda's tyranny had finally lifted, and though things were far from perfect, Daniel knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter for them. It wasn't just about justice for Max. It was about reclaiming their peace, their lives, and their family. They had faced the storm, and they had emerged united and stronger than ever. The world would still have its challenges, but Daniel knew one thing for sure: as long as they had each other, they could handle anything that came their way. The weeks following the resolution of the ordeal were a time of deep reflection for Daniel and Max. Their world had been turned upside down in a matter of days, but now, as the dust began to settle, they found themselves standing in a new reality, a reality where their strength had been tested, but where they had emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. Daniel often found himself looking back on the events that had transpired, replaying every moment, trying to make sense of it all. He had been a detective for most of his life, dealing with criminals, threats, and danger. But this was different. This wasn't just another case. It was personal. It was his family, his son, and the woman who had threatened everything they held dear. The moments when Max had been under threat haunted Daniel, but he found solace in knowing he had done everything in his power to protect him. But the truth, Daniel realized, wasn't just about physical protection. It was about the emotional scars that came with it. Max had been through something no child should have to experience. The trauma of that moment, the fear of having a gun pointed at him, would stay with Max for a long time. And as a father, Daniel knew that the Real challenge was helping Max heal emotionally to make sure he didn't carry that fear with him forever. He had always taught Max to be resilient, to face challenges head on, but now, Daniel had to show him that it was okay to feel vulnerable, to be afraid, that it didn't make him weak, it made him human. For Max, the road to healing was a long and winding one. The first few days after Linda's arrest were filled with moments of clarity and peace, but they were also filled with anxiety. Max would wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, his heart racing, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He had trouble returning to his normal routine. His sketchbook, once a source of comfort, now fell heavy in his hands. The world, once a place he had navigated with hope and curiosity, now felt colder, more threatening. But with Daniel by his side, Max slowly began to find his way back. The father-son bond they shared had always been strong, but it was during these difficult days that Daniel realized just how deep that connection ran. Max was still the same brilliant, imaginative, and creative boy he had always been. But now he was learning how to face the world differently. He was learning that fear didn't have to define him. That while the world could be a dangerous place, there was also kindness, love, and strength to be found. Daniel took every opportunity to remind Max of the person he truly was. They spent time together, talking about everything and nothing. They went on walks, took trips to the park, and even worked on Max's sketches together. It wasn't about forcing Max to move on. It was about giving him the space to heal at his own pace, to let him know that no matter what, he wasn't alone. And slowly, the terror that had once gripped Max's heart began to loosen its hold. Max would smile again, and that smile was everything to Daniel. It was a sign that they were moving forward, even if it was just one small step at a time. For Daniel, the experience also made him reflect on his own role as a father. He had always prided himself on being strong, on protecting those he loved. But this ordeal had shown him that true strength wasn't just about physical protection, it was about emotional resilience. It was about showing up when your loved ones needed you the most, even when you didn't have all the answers. And it was about being vulnerable, too, allowing himself to admit that he couldn't always control everything, that sometimes the only thing he could do was be there to offer his love and support without judgment. Linda's arrest had been a turning point, not just for Max, but for the entire community. The neighborhood that had once lived under the oppressive rule of Linda Matthews had started to heal, too. People who had been too afraid to speak out now felt empowered. The unity that had once been fractured was now being rebuilt, and there was a sense of pride in the air. The community had fought back against the injustice that Linda had brought upon them, and they had won. It was a reminder to Daniel that change was possible, that even the smallest actions, like standing up for what's right, could have a ripple effect that reached far beyond what anyone could imagine. As Daniel looked at his son, now more confident and at ease than he had been just weeks ago, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Max had gone through something incredibly difficult, and yet he was still here, still fighting, still learning to trust the world around him. In the face of danger, Max had shown incredible courage, and Daniel knew that he would carry that strength with him for the rest of his life. The experience had taught both of them a powerful lesson, that in the darkest moments, there was always light, that love, support, and resilience were the keys to overcoming even the most harrowing of situations. And most importantly, they had learned that no matter what life threw at them, they had each other. The message was clear. We all have the power to fight back against injustice, no matter how big or small. We all have the strength within us to overcome fear, to rebuild, and to stand up for what's right. Max had proven that, and in doing so, he had shown Daniel that as long as they stood together, there was nothing they couldn't face. If you found strength in Max's story, if you've ever faced adversity or felt like the world was against you, share your thoughts with us. How did you find the courage to stand up for yourself? We want to hear your story, your struggles, and your triumphs. Leave a comment below, and let's continue the conversation about overcoming fear, fighting for justice, and building a better, more supportive world for everyone. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and hope.